running out of time now. So the first question is, do we have the data? And the reality is, can we just fast forward to all of the animations on this slide? Most available data is biased, and most methods to overcome those biases introduce further biases. So they are not appropriate. And the only solutions for this are better data, not ways to try to pretend that biases don't exist. Next slide, please. So in order to set targets, which is very challenging, and again, this slide has a lot of animations, here we tried to look to see how we could use data on bees. Now, of course, invertebrates have very little data on their distributions, which means modeling them can be virtually impossible. So we integrated checklist data to cross-reference with global distribution data. We found that it is possible to model where species are. However, it is not possible to do it unless we use completely different approaches, like using inventories of sites and using richness as a proxy. So I'll go on to the next slide, please. So here you can see the biases that exist in the data. The top one is from a database showing species richness. The second one is from the data sampling. The second one is from the database showing richness. And the third one is a checklist. We can see when we use a checklist, we get entirely different patterns on species range boundaries. Next slide, please. Next. If we look to see where data is, we can see that whilst Asia has 15% of the world's bee species, it has less than 1% of the world's data. However, we can circumvent this, and we can use that to reproduce reliably patterns of species richness across the planet that can then feed into other forms of analyses. Next slide, please. We can also use this kind of data, okay, go to the end of this slide, to map out priorities for different taxa and assay how well these areas are protected. So ultimately, when we come to building standards, go to the end of animations on this, we find that most of the world is unsampled. We can automate data collection. We can also cross-reference this with other types of data like bioacoustic data to provide continuous cross-referenceable data on where species are. However, we need to use entirely different approaches in order to do this accurately. Because I've run out of time, I'm going to end on this slide with a synthesis of basically, in order to map species distributions, in order to develop effective targets, we need better data than we have now. This will require everyone. Citizen science can help us get there by generating better data in terms of phenology and understanding species distribution in time. However, to understand distributions in the parts of the planet that are least well representative, we need centralized data from scientists, and we need core standards to get there. What we've seen is with the growth of data, we've had an increasing fragmentation, and many data sets do not follow the standards that allow them to be used. We all need to be part of the solution so we can develop better targets and make sure that as we move into the future, we can synergize targets between different conventions to make sure they are data-based, and that we also have the monitoring data that we need to meet those targets for the future. So I'm looking forward to hearing the rest of this panel. I apologize for going over time. These slides are designed for me to control, so thank you all.
Thanks very much, Alice, and thanks for that very clear message, and also for doing that with the challenges of running remote slides. So our next speaker is Dr. Anang Setiawan Ahmadi, who is the Mammals Creator Researcher at the Museum of Zoologicum Bogoriense, and who will speak in Indonesia, and who will speak to us about open science for biodiversity data in Indonesia. Dr. Anang, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Simon, for the introduction. So, and at this time, I think I would like to share about our experience, how it's difficult to establish, how it's difficult to develop the database management in Indonesia, especially related to the biodiversity from Indonesia. So I think because we've been started since 2003 until now, and I think not very many data that we can share, and especially because we have change in the organizations. So before September, so I will still associated with LIPI, or Indonesian Institute of Science, and right now change it into National Research and Innovation Agency, which is everything just changed and everything just right now under construction and restructure everything. So next, please. So I think just move to the next slide. As we know that Indonesia has one of the mega diversity in the world, and right now number third. And then one of the difficulties is because we have 17,480 islands in this country, so sometimes like so difficult to organize or to manage with the other island. And then also not just the diversity itself, but also the culture diversity, the so many very many ethnic groups, linguistic diversity itself. So next, please. Yeah, and then I think we all know about how the species diversity in the world 8.7, which is 1.6 million described, and then Indonesia number third. So top 5 biodiversity countries. This is maybe make Indonesia. It's sometimes give us a big challenge in the organization or in the management of the database or the biodiversity database itself. Next. So this is the compositions until now. I mean, in Indonesia, species diversity for the terrestrial biota right now. So the from the fauna, the vertebrate. So we have 773 species. The birds are mostly like 1,600 species. Amphibians almost 400. Reptiles 700 something, and then freshwater fishes at 1,248 species, and other flora diversity, which is amazing. And we've been collected that species from about maybe 30,000 to 40,000 predicted species in from Indonesia. So next, please. And then this is the marine biota from Indonesia. It's a very amazing numbers too about the species diversity from the marines. So for the fauna and algae and flora and microbes, and all the species just like maybe less than 50%. So that we've been collected or we've been documented. Next. Yeah, so this is why make Indonesia very important in the diversity. We try to organize every year because we realize that they have values and important values, especially for the economic and ecological and also the culture. So I mean, for wildlife habitat and diversity regulation, ecological resilience, crop pollination, pest control, and other, and etc. And next, please. And this is the biodiversity management in Indonesia. Maybe not very different with the other countries. So because every year we always conducted the exploration, the expedition for the flora, fauna, and microbes. And so many scientists will be invited and join in the explorations, not just from our institution, but also we collaborate with the academic, with the universities, also with the other researchers from other organizations. And then after that, we deposit in our museums, and we have Herbarium Bogoriense and Museum Zoological Bogoriense, and also Indonesian Culture Collection. And then And then next steps, we try to strengthen our data management and documentations of this biological collection. So we try harder to do that every year. But and then after that, we can use for the species analysis, and then we try to investigate the bioprospecting for this. Next, please. And then maybe some of you know about the INABIF, which is Indonesian Biodiversity Information Facility, which is we try to provide an effective, efficient, and accessible database on the biodiversity, not just to national, but also try to provide to the global. And then we, okay, next. So yeah, this is the story of our establishment, which is like a wave sometimes. We've been started 2004, which is on that year, the name is National Biodiversity Information Network, but and then collapsed in 2007, and then since 2007 until 2012, we don't have any activities, and then initiate program on 2012, and then the 2013 launching of INABIF, and then we joining to the GBIF, to the global networks, and then until 2018, we strengthening, expanding network nationally, and then we joining or in collaborations with the clearinghouse mechanism developed by the Ministry of Environment and Forestry. And then unfortunately 2019 until now, we restructure the system, and because we have so many things to do, like in our institution, so we have to stop for a while until maybe the next year, or in the future will be some a new system, and will be coordinated from by the new organizations in BRIN or in a National Research Innovation Agency. Okay, next. Also, this is the mission and vision. I think not very different with the others system in this country. Next, please. So this is the target and activities of INABIF. We start 2013 and then until 2019, and then in 2020 we stop for a while, restructure, and I think yeah, any inputs, comments from all of the participants, or maybe from the panelists, would be very helpful to us to strengthen. Okay, next. Next, please. Next slide. Okay. So this is the achievements until 2008. And then until, yeah, okay, just this slide. So this, recently we tried to add more data in our server. So until now, maybe 1.5 million already in our server. So, but we have so many links here. But just maybe we need to discuss in the future, especially maybe with the GBIF in the future. Okay, next. Next, please. So this is the data, the fauna data in Indonesia for July 2021. So we have 473 or 153 records. Next. Yeah, for the microbes, we have right now 5,135 records. Next. So this is the botany. So the flora, there are more than the others. So we have 844,266 reports. Okay, next. So we, yeah, maybe as I mentioned before, we've been sharing data since 2013, joined with GBIF, but I think that all the person in charge, all the mention in there, we have to update it later. Next. Next, please. So I think the last slide. Next. Yeah, so this is yeah, okay. So this is the plan that we will try to complete or to provide in the next future. So this is, but we still organize internally in our organization. I think that's my presentation today. So thank you very much, Simon.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anang, and for giving us that picture of activities in Indonesia. Hand over to our final speaker now, who is Tim Hirsch, Deputy Director and Head of Participation and Engagement at the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, GBIF. And Tim will talk to us about, your title's changed, Filling the Tropical Biodiversity Data Gap.
Thank you, Simon. Apologies for the change of title. As you were watching, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much as well to Professor Masland for the opportunity to speak at this very important event. As you will see, the title of my slide that I put in now refers to the Tropical Biodiversity Data Gap, because as we've already heard, I think we all agree that it is a critical task for everyone that we collectively address this issue. If we could go to the next slide, please. Just a very quick summary of what GBIF is, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, as a global infrastructure. As not everyone will be fully familiar with what we are and what we do. So we are an intergovernmental initiative. We're just celebrating our 20th anniversary of founding in 2001, and we exist through a voluntary memorandum of understanding among our participating governments with a secretariat in Denmark. And you'll see on the right, this is the homepage of the gbif.org website as it is now, and I would just highlight really the numbers there. So we're coming up towards 1.9 billion species occurrence records that are being shared to us or to the world using common standards from more than 1,700 institutions from encompassing more than 120 countries. So the volume of data that's coming through to GBIF is obviously very considerable. Next slide, please. In terms of what GBIF does as an infrastructure, its function really is to bring together data relating to very diverse, very heterogeneous types of information that are scattered around the world, each of which essentially provide part of that picture of where species have lived, where they live now, which then enables the kind of modeling and understanding that's already been referred to. The diversity includes, for example, specimens, observations and surveys, which includes increasingly citizen science, data that can be extracted from literature, some forms of machine observations, for example, the satellite tagging of animals to show movements, and increasingly an important source of data is essentially the DNA sampling of the environment, which is giving really providing something of a revolution of our ability to understand distributions across taxa. And through bringing all of that together through the use of common standards, we're then able to provide that instant common access, which can feed into research, into policy through, for example, the CBD, assessments such as IPBES, and indeed the assessments of species extinction risk through IUCN. Next slide, please. In terms of the benefits, what's the overall benefit of bringing all this data together for access? And I think it's important to note, and we can do this through looking at the citation of the use of GBIF in the research literature, that this goes well beyond what you might expect as the primary benefit, which is information about conservation for protected areas, species threats, invasive species, etc. The data that is openly shared using common standards through GBIF also feeds into information and decisions on right across the sustainable development area. So that includes, for example, information relating to food security, to climate change, principally adaptation, but also some aspects of mitigation. And increasingly, and obviously critically in terms of the current situation, biodiversity data is very important in research and decisions relating to human health, in particular, the distribution of vectors, hosts, and reservoirs of human diseases. Next slide, please. So we're going into some of the aspects of biases and where we have and where we haven't got strength in this global network. You'll see on the top right, this is our formal national participation in terms of governments that are current signatories of our MOU and formally participating. And you can see there are big gaps in the world there, very prominently in terms of Asia at the moment. And that's something which is critical for us to continue to work on in terms of engagement. On the bottom right map, that's a slightly different view, which is a view of the institutions that are sharing data through GBIF, which is not exclusive to our formal membership. And you can see there that our reach, our spread in terms of participating institutions is wider. However, it is still very much concentrated in the wealthier parts of the planet. Next slide, please. Now, I did just a very quick search for the purpose of this presentation, really to emphasize what's been said already in terms of the biases and the overall global tendency for more data to come from, if you like, where there is less biodiversity. So what I've done here is simply filtered the occurrence records available through GBIF by the tropic lines that you can see on the map on the left. And the figure really is very striking. In total, in terms of our species occurrence records, we have fewer than 170 million records out of 1.77 billion georeference records, or 9.5% of all records with coordinates occurring within the tropic lines, which obviously is, in a sense, it's a rather shocking reflection of the extent to which the volume of data shared through GBIF is focused on outside the tropics. And you can see on the bottom right there, just from that search, just a quick analysis of the biggest data sets that are contributing to those tropical records. And you can see there that the first two are the big citizen science networks of eBird and iNaturalist. And for the remainder, you may be able to see that most of the data sets there are actually collections from countries outside the tropics that are sharing data related to specimens collected within the tropics. So, for example, the Tropicos specimen data is from Missouri Botanic Gardens. You can see the Naturalis Biodiversity Center in the Netherlands, and the bottom one is the Natural History Museum at the Smithsonian in the United States. So while you can also see there, for example, the Southern Africa Bird Atlas Project, Insects of Costa Rica, a big survey there, there are examples of data coming out of the tropics, but currently the majority of what is being shared relating to biodiversity in the tropics is from either institutions or at least networks that are located in other regions. Next slide, please. So what can we do about this? One approach that we have been able to take in GBIF over the past few years is to develop programs relating to the capacity of institutions in different parts of the world to acquire the basic skills and buy into the open data principles in order to share data through GBIF. And we've had a fair amount of success on that, for example, through the Biodiversity Information Fund for Asia, which is funded, sorry, if I just quickly go back, from the Ministry of Environment in Japan, and a program called Biodiversity Information for Development, which is funding from the European Union, which has generated significant data from Africa, Caribbean, and the Pacific and the Asia region. Next slide, please. And just one example of the way in which even a relatively modest scale of data mobilization can have really significant impacts is here from one project highlighted from the Asia program, where we funded the Southeast Asian bat conservation research organization to mobilize data from acoustic records of bats in many countries in Southeast Asia. And this brought into the GBIF network data on bat species that simply had not been available before. And on the right, you can see that there was a recent example of a study, in fact, co-authored by Alice on our panel, relating to the evolutionary origins of coronaviruses, in particular SARS-CoV-2, which significantly used data from these newly mobilized data sets. One more slide here, just to finish. Next slide, please. I would just emphasize that I think one critical importance of having a global initiative and global infrastructure such as GBIF is that we are able to create efficiency so that when there is a need for national or regional biodiversity data portals, and I'm showing examples here of the Pacific portal recently launched by SPREP in the Pacific Islands region, and on the right, a national portal from Colombia. We are now offering a service so that all of the back-end work and the data flows going out into these portals can be managed at a global level, saving significant costs and development work in countries, so that the focus can be on the specific information that is important to those countries or regions or institutions, and making use of what's already been developed and it's already available at a global level. So I just emphasize this. In a sense, the message is you don't need to reinvent the wheel. There is plenty out there already that can be made use of. And I would say this could be an important approach when we look at addressing the tropical data gap, just to understand what there is out there in terms of the global infrastructure, which means that through collaboration, we can get to where we need to get to in the most efficient way and at the least cost. So that's where I'll stop. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you very much to all our speakers, to Alice and Dr. Anang as well. Maslan, we're going to co-moderate this discussion.
Yes.
And I think we're going to ask for input in the chat as well,
right,
from participants. Would you like me to lead off? I've got a little summary of the points.
There are questions already from the audience, but please, you can start it.
Okay. I don't see any in my chat feed, so maybe you'll have to do the ones from the audience.
Okay,
but maybe
I will do those from the audience, yes.
Okay, okay. Oh, I see one from Ross Wilkinson, but before...
Yes, that's right. Those are the questions.
Give the floor to Ross.
Good.
I'd like to... So we've heard there from, and we tried, in our discussion, the preparation of this session, we tried to have a bit of an arc. We heard a very powerful call from a researcher saying there is not enough data and it's often biased and we need correction and we need to address this. We had an example of a national facility which is gathering biodiversity data from Indonesia. And then moving sort of upwards in our story arc, if you like, we had an example of the global biodiversity information facility, how we collect this and present this at a global level. And something that I've always been impressed with GBIF is how they show the connections between the data and the research which is created out of it. And I think that's a real lesson to all data facilities. I'd like to ask a question of Alice. You made it clear about the paucity in some instances of data, how it's limited to where roads are, where it's collected, how sometimes it's bias limited by national boundaries. I heard you say we need researchers to share their data more. What else? How do we address those gaps? And what would your recommendations be to addressing those data gaps?
Alice, you're muted, Alice. We can't hear you. Could you unmute yourself? Why aren't we hearing Alice, please? Nope. Technical team here can't hear you, Alice.
Yeah, I'm still occasionally getting a spinning wheel, so I think Alice's connection's not.
Alice, say
not the
something,
best.
Alice, and we'll see whether we can hear you. Nope, we're still not hearing you. It looks like your screen is downloading something from this end.
While we're fixing Alice's issues, maybe I can direct a similar question to Dr. Anang and then to Tim. How would you respond to Alice's call for action in Indonesia? What would you do to increase the amount of data and to make sure that it was as representative as possible?
Thank you, Simon. I think try to address the question. So for in Indonesia, it is also a problem for us to increase the data. It's so a big challenge for us, because I think the same problem in the other countries, that how it's difficult to convince the scientists to share the data. So right now we try to focus on our database first, and then when we have it online, and then we share to the others. So we show to the researcher in Indonesia how useful the information in the portals or in the website to the research, especially when we have when we arrange the research, or when we decided the locations in the future that we need to fill the data gaps that we have. But again, that it is not an easy way in Indonesia, because I think one of our experiences how it's difficult that the one of the project that funded by BIVA, like biodiversity, it is difficult to convince in the university to share the data that they have from the thesis or on the other data. But I think we organized one by one. We met with the key persons in the university also, and then we tried to meet with the key person in the NGO or the others. And that's difficult, but we try. That's maybe the points from Indonesia, because I mean, even in the Java Island, so many universities, but we try harder, and not with the other universities in the other island like Borneo or maybe Papua, the eastern part of Indonesia. That's really a big challenge for us. Maybe that's my point. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you, Dr. Anang, because it looked as if you had an impressive data platform. So maybe the issue lies elsewhere with that sharing of data from research projects or research activities in universities. Alice, are you back with us? Can you hear us?
We still can't hear you,
We
Alice.
still can't hear you. Okay. Thanks, Alice. So, Tim, you mentioned capacity building and training, awareness raising. What issues do you encounter as GBIF at the global level of filling data gaps? Is it a matter of reluctance is it that the data is not being gathered? Is it and the capacity is not there? Is it a matter of awareness raising and hearts and minds, if you like, that that good data is being gathered in universities and other research institutes, but is not being shared? Or is it something else? How would you address, how would you characterize the challenge, and how would you address the challenge?
I think, in a sense, it's all of the things that you mentioned, and what I think you find is that very often the specific challenges that arise in particular countries are barriers and challenges that you see repeated throughout the world. But of course, the context is different in every country, and that's why it's really critical that engagement is done at the level closest to those communities as possible, because we as a global network can't possibly address all of those to give them justice. However, I think that there are some common themes where we can at least suggest approaches that can help to address those. So in terms of the reluctance, and we all recognise that is an issue across science and institutions, in a sense, and I'm going to use a phrase which doesn't translate very well into other languages, there is a carrot and stick approach, if you like. So there are ways in which you can, first of all, help to provide more positive incentives for people to share, and in some cases, actually bring in rules and regulations that will assist in mobilizing more data. So in terms of some of the incentives, I think the fact that we can demonstrate to those sharing data the way in which the shared data is then used and cited in onward research can itself be a reasonably powerful tool, so that, if you like, the investment that an institution is making in digitization and sharing, we can show the onward value. We can help them to see the onward value in terms of the benefit that is providing, which will often be within a country, or more broadly about understanding for biodiversity. So there is the recognition and the credit that can be accrued to those sharing data. And I think that's increasingly being recognized within science as well. So that, for example, data publications, data papers, data descriptors, as they are variously described in journals, are seen as an important part of academic achievement. So that the tendency to want to hold on to all of your own data until you publish that great research, which is going to help your career, to some extent that can be overcome by a growing recognition that data sharing is an important part of the scientific endeavor. So those are some of the incentives. On the more, I won't say compulsion, but on the more regulatory side, there is an increasing tendency for the public funders of research to insist that data generated as part of that investment should be shared because it belongs to the world and it has been essentially mobilized by public funds. So in quite a few countries now, and I think the UNESCO recommendation should be a really important additional tool to help with this. I think we can see that there's a recognition that particularly publicly funded science should have a requirement to share data that has been generated through that investment.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks for the UNESCO recommendation does mention those two modes, if you like, that the benefits which we see by comparison with a number of research domains of both for individual scientists, but even more so for the research conducted as such, and the increasing public good requirement for the data availability and the corresponding legislative or moral obligation to make the data available.
I don't know whether Alice, are you in with us? Can you say something?
Be able to hear me now.
I'm not hearing. Your volume is way down, apparently, Alice.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're struggling with that, Simon. I'd like to ask Tim a question, because one of the barriers to data sharing if you look at the CBD analysis, that barrier results from a lack of widely agreed classification systems for some types of biodiversity. How serious is that problem, and how far is that a reason for not sharing data?
There's clearly a tremendous challenge just with the complexities around taxonomy and identification of species. It certainly makes it a great, I mean, an informatics challenge apart from anything else, to make sure that what is shared is fully consistent, and that you can compare one record with another record. There is, and you know, what GBIF cannot attempt to try and solve that issue, because taxonomy is constantly changing, as you know. So a species which has one name 10 years ago may be entirely reclassified. And the best that can be done there is to ensure that part of the data that is shared and kept up to date is indeed all of the taxonomic data that gives an up-to-date picture of how that taxonomy is using, which names could be regarded, for example, as synonyms with another name, and as far as possible, through the use of a common taxonomic backbone, which is the way that GBIF sorts all of the data, at least we can provide some consistency and some interpretation of the data that is coming in, understanding that different countries and indeed different networks may be using different taxonomies for their own purposes. So I would say that although it is a significant challenge, the classification issue, it shouldn't really be a barrier in terms of the sharing of data. Understanding that that in itself creates issues of quality and that means that it's a constantly moving picture, and so we're never going to end up with the final solid classification of all species. So as long as that issue is incorporated in a dynamic way, such that data shared through whatever original name can be interpreted as relating to a taxon that may have had a different name in the past, then I don't think it should really be a significant barrier.
True, I would believe that, but there has been opinions that you know, that is part of the reason why some people have not put in the data, is because there is that problem with classification. Simon, do you want to go through some of the questions from the audience? You want me to read them?
That would be a good idea. Yes. Why don't you two?
Okay. There's a question here. I think I will open to all of you. What if we have good data, but collection centers refuse to share them due to fear of hacking or maybe poaching to access spatial info by poachers? This is especially true of medicinal plants data. How do we get such centers to share their data? Maybe Pak Anang, you can address this, because I'm sure in Indonesia that's a big problem, poaching.
Yeah, of course, exactly what happened in Indonesia. But right now we have an ongoing process or activities to provide the regulation related to the shared data. So we try to leveling which data that share all publicly, or we just share a part of the information. So if the users need more information, so they need to contact personally with the website or the administration or the programmer. I think try to feel this year about this regulation and agreement about the shared data in Indonesia, because I think like the questions like the negative impact that can be happen for the poacher or something like that. So we try to regulations and it's a collaboration between Ministry of Environment and Health and also BRIN and also the other institutions such as universities, something like that.
So Simon, this reminds me of the philosophy of open science, or the principle of open science. We are as open as possible and as closed as necessary. Tim, you wanted to say something, please, Tim.
Thank you. If I could just add something to that. This is obviously an issue that comes up all the time in terms of data sharing. There are some guidelines that we recently updated relating to the way in which data on sensitive species, which this obviously would be an example, can be generalized to whatever resolution is selected by the person or the institution sharing the data. So, for example, if the threat relates to sharing knowledge of very precise locations that would guide a poacher to a particular site, then it's perfectly feasible for that researcher to share data, but at lower resolution. So it could be at a 5 kilometer or a 10 kilometer or even a larger radius from the site. And the point there is that that's still sharing data, so that depending on the onward use of the data, having it even at a less precise resolution may still be, in some contexts, useful and important in terms of understanding the distribution of that species. So it will vary from case to case, but because the principle is that that resolution and what components of data are actually shared on open platforms is at the control of the researcher, it is possible to take these very important issues into account, but not necessarily say that all of that data should be shared, because there's always, I think, a risk and benefit analysis that needs to be done. Yes, there are risks for particular species in divulging precise locations, but on the other hand, if the attitude is that there should be no open data on highly threatened species, then you're actually preventing very important data from going into the global knowledge base. So I think there's always a balance of risks and benefits that needs to be applied here.
Agreed. Can we go back to Alice? Alice, try your mic. I know you're hearing us, but try and say something, Alice, and see whether we have a problem.
Are you able to hear me now?
Yes, yes. Please, come in quickly.
It may be Chinese internet. Okay, so I'll build on a couple of those points. First off, in terms of incentivizing data, Tim has talked a lot about this already. Scientists need recognition. Collecting data in the field is tough. It takes time away from collecting from writing papers. Also, you can injure yourself, etc. So there's a whole lot of things that come into there that means scientists may not be willing to share that data, especially if they think, I might get a publication one day, then I'll get all the credit. Institutes have to be much better at recognizing the data. Grant agencies have to be much better in insisting not only is that data shared, but it is shared on a centralized platform. What we are seeing now is everyone chooses their own set of standards, their own set of places. And that means if you want to collect a data set for any given species, you probably have to go to Figshare and Dryad and GBIF and OBIS, and you can't get that complete set. And we need to unite the data. Something else the others have talked about is the fact that many rarer species may be made vulnerable by going into these databases. Now, this is true. There are at least 21 amphibian species that are thought to have had their entire wild populations collected by the pet trade. For new species or species that may be vulnerable to things like the pet trade in particular, then there are real reasons not to share that data. However, this is a double-edged sword. We know that collectors use this data, but at the same time, we need to prioritize these areas for their conservation value. So for those kinds of species, we do need to find more nuanced ways of either making those ecosystems mappable in some other way, or by having high priority data which only scientists could access given certain credentials. There is never any panacea for this. There are always costs and benefits. But ultimately, if we don't know where to protect, we can't protect them. And for things like karst endemics, so Goniosaurus and Cyrtodactylus are two popular pet geckos in the pet trade. Many of them will only live on a single karst hill. So there are conservation reasons for wanting to know where they are, but we know they go straight into the pet trade. Finding solutions for taxa like that are very, very challenging. And so we do need to think about better ways of keeping those species safe whilst making sure data is available for those who can use it for conservation prioritization.
Simon, did you want to pick up that question by Ross?
Well, actually, I'd like to ask a question.
Yes, please,
Alice, because she
Simon.
said something very. There's a very interesting response to two angles of that, but something that I'd like to pick up on is the statement when we need to bring it together. The moment where researchers are having to find data from many different sources, from GBIF, from Dryad, from Figshare, etc. We need to bring it together. What in your view, Alice, does that bringing it together look like? And I ask that because we can present a vision where we have a set of domain-specific national data repositories, like the one that we presented from Indonesia, providing additional and richer data than they might give to GBIF, where there's it's very much on the species identification, location, time data. Is there a need for something which, on the basis of that nationally collected data or regionally collected data, then federates and integrates a richer set of data sets, either through GBIF or something analogious?
That's a great question. So I think the first thing to bear in mind is the premier repository of mapping species is something like the IUCN, if you look to see where species map ranges are in that. Now, if we look and we compare GBIF data to those species ranges, even when we clean the GBIF data, we found about 50% of species range points are outside where those species are meant to be. Those data sets are not being integrated now. Now let's think about the case of having separate national repositories, and say I want to map out something like a tiger. Now, for many species, they are not just in one country. If every country has their own private data set, it means that when we are thinking about species-level conservation, we cannot aggregate the data. Now, there are reasons, again, to protect it, especially if it is a valuable species that may be vulnerable to poaching. But we do need to find better ways to make that data available to the people trying to target it, and also to integrate it into things like the IUCN portal. Now, I am not someone who advocates drawing on a map where I think a species is a good way to map it. I think we do need to be having these more data-based approaches that are using improvements of maxent and species distribution models based on dynamic mapping of where species are. Now, there are ways to hide the source data points, so you can have a network that pulls in from these different national portals without necessarily giving you the actual distribution points out. Something like that could protect countries' data while still feeding into conservation. And I think GBIF has done a phenomenal job in aggregating data and now grappling with progressively challenging data types. But we do need ways that centralize it, because unless we bring together species data for individual species, then we can't conserve them. And that becomes even worse when you think about things like migratory species. So there are 50 million birds every year that migrate across the East Australian Asian flyway, the EAF. Think about if every single country kept the data to themselves. You can't conserve the species based on that. But you can find ways to share that data in a way that keeps data private that the countries want to, but can feed up into something bigger that allows dynamic understanding of species ranges and can enable targeted conservation. I don't think we are there yet, but I think if we have those kinds of conversations, we can protect national interests whilst also providing the data we need to protect species.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I was less concerned about national interests, and I'm sure those come into play, than the source of funding and investment.
Simon,
which is often at a national level. Yes?
Well, may I go back to your point about bringing data together and the need for federating databases? Maybe Tim could weigh in on that, on the federation of databases, particularly in the tropics?
Yes, thank you. And I think that the general message I would have is that we really want to avoid, I think, setting up alternatives of either you share it this way or you share it that way, at least with regard to data of similar types. And obviously, the starting point needs to be that we can standardize data into formats that can be shared through a range of different platforms. Given that, I think the tendency that we're seeing and we're working towards is to recognize that there are different platforms that serve particular needs, whether they are thematic, let's say OBIS relating to marine, national, where you can have some sub-national boundary contexts that are very important and much other information, and then what's shared through GBIF globally. What we're looking at is increasingly to have shared facilities and pipelines so that what goes in will be a single step of sharing that from one platform can feed all of these different needs at different scales, but without the need to repeat all of that processing in pipelines and different application of quality standards, because we're all really after the same thing. Yep. So not to try and homogenize everything so that the access and the output in terms of the user is only through one platform, but to understand that through collaboration and through shared facilities, we can make this whole process more efficient and not require, for example, for researchers to try and decide, well, I'm going to share either with this platform or that platform. If we all work together, I think we can serve the needs both of the providers and the users.
Pak Anang, what would be your view on that, on the federation of the databases?
My view, maybe for Southeast Asia, it is better. We have some federations, even we use the same platforms like GBIF, but I think we try. It will be better for us, for Southeast Asia countries, that we establish networks among the countries in Southeast Asia, and then so we can discuss about, we share about all the problems, which is I'm pretty sure that it's different, maybe in Malaysia or in Indonesia or other from Vietnam or Laos, maybe also have different problems, so we can share, and we try to solve, or maybe we try to find a way to solve it, something like that, because I think because our culture may be not very different, but the difference may be the data quality or the information. I think that's my view, Dr. Maslan.
Simon, I'm going to hand it over to you for the next bit of the moderation, and then you can wrap up the session.
Well, I mean, I think that was a very nice discussion on the potential of federation. And I see that the panel discussed, our timer is ending. So are we just wrapping up the session now, Maslan?
According to me, I've got few more minutes, 3 more minutes, Simon.
Okay, I was just looking at the indicators. It says panel discussion.
Yeah, it says end, but my time says it's 3 more minutes.
Okay, so let's take Ross Wilkinson's question. He says there was a request that biodiversity researchers better convey their research to the public. Is making biodiversity data open enough, or will that just be for other researchers? What else is needed? How would panelists respond to that? Is our primary concern making sure that we have the data, or do we need to do a work of more open outreach science in the spirit of whether it's citizen science, citizen engagement with science, or transdisciplinary research? Does anyone want to respond to that?
I'll take a first crack. So from what I see, there are 2 major elements of why citizen science is important. One is collecting the data, and the other is engaging with people. Now, for conservation targets to be successful, you need to have people who care about biodiversity. If people have no contextualization, no relationship with biodiversity, they are not going to try to make conscious decisions to try to conserve it. So whilst we tend to think about citizen science as a data generation exercise, actually the fact that people can realize that they are participating in something bigger can also help them engage in better life decisions in terms of sustainability. We are going to reach future targets. It will require human behavioral change. And I think this is something we don't even think of when it comes to data generation. The other part is that you can't have scientists collecting data across the landscape. There are not millions of scientists scouring the landscape, especially when it comes to things like species phenology. We need to make sure that we have high quality data. And the best way to do that is by people who are active and motivated to see their first hummingbird of the year. And if we look at the US as an example, they have monarch butterfly, hummingbird, etc. All of these different sets of phenologically really important data sets. And it's data sets that, like those, they're actually allowing us to see how species are responding to climate change. So citizen science fulfills several different roles, and they don't completely overlap with scientific data. One thing they do better is they allow us to see seasonal changes in species distributions. And that's also something that's really important and is often overlooked. Another important thing they can do is also help us see where diseases pop up, because if there are people going out and they see rust, etc., they can allow tracking of invasives, etc., to far higher resolution than scientists can. So the public has to be part of the picture, not just for collecting the data, but also for being part of the global ecosystem of collecting data and turning it into something we can use to inform change.
Thank you, Alice. I think that was a very powerful reply. It also helps address one of the other questions in the chat, which is what are the major benefits and challenges of multidisciplinary collaboration? And there, I think of transdisciplinary research, engaging with communities which are at the cusp of this interface of for example, deforestation or other mechanisms by which biodiversity is reduced, and involving those communities in research activities and policy development such that the value of biodiversity is understood and those communities have a say in the research and the activity. I'm just going to throw that out there. Maslan, I have to go and share another session.
Yes, me too.
So,
Simon,
if I may,
yes.
I'm going to say thank you very much to our panelists.
Yes.
I hope the message about open science was a powerful one, and I hope we can continue this discussion about tropical biodiversity. I will leave.
Thank you, Simon.
Right,
we'll say farewell to you, and I'll just wrap this up. Thank you.
All right.
Okay, thank you so much for coming and giving your insights on this issue. Very, very important issue of tropical biodiversity, but more importantly, that data we need to maintain in order for us to understand biodiversity better, but in our context now, tropical biodiversity. This is going to be the beginning of some intense conversations. So I hope to be able to keep engaging every one of you here. And maybe next time we'll have a whole conference on this issue. And I know there are already several issues, several conferences addressing the same issues we are discussing today. So I'd like to thank Tim, Alice, and Pak Anang for joining us. Well, for you, some of you morning, and for some of you evening. And as I said, we'd like to further collaborate with you in discussing the issues further. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Have a great conference.
Thank you. Okay.